Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Research Revealed Why Workplace Wellbeing is Key to Company Performance. My name is Caitlin, and I'm an Associate Marketing Manager at the Myers-Briggs Company. So today's webinar will run for approximately 1 hour. Please feel free to submit questions using the questions box at any time throughout the webinar, and we will answer those at the end. The webinar is being recorded, and we will send out an email with a link to the recording and a copy of the slides in the next few days. There will be some engagement throughout this webinar. We do have some polls as well as some reflections and chat functions. So for those, please be sure to use the questions box to submit your responses to the chats, and we will be reading those out for the group. So now I'm happy to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rich Thompson. Rich is the Senior Director of Global Research at the Myers-Briggs Company. His primary responsibilities include the development and maintenance of personality assessments for use in organizational training and development. So welcome, Rich. I will turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Caitlin, and thank you everyone for being here. Appreciate your time. So we're going to spend about an hour talking a little bit about this idea of well-being, and in particular workplace well-being, why it's important, how to measure it, what affects it, and the role that personality, particularly MBTI-type personality, plays in well-being. And we're going to be drawing on some research that we've been doing for the last 5 years to talk through some important relationships with well-being and some organizational outcomes. And then at the end, talk a little bit about some things you could do in your organization to improve your employees' well-being. So this is the mission statement for the Myers-Briggs Company, and it's to inspire everyone to lead more successful and fulfilling lives. And I think it really fits in with the idea of well-being in general, as well as well-being at work, because oftentimes organizations, focus on things that are good for the organization and not necessarily good for the employees. And I think well-being and workplace well-being allows the organization to shift its focus from what's good for us to what's good for the employees that might be good for us. And it fits, like I said, very nicely with our organizational mission. So well-being is not a new idea. It's been around for a very long time. If you go back to Buddha, his teachings suggest that, in his own words, we are what we think, meaning that our level of well-being really is part of our cognitive thoughts, cognitive functions, and that the things that we think about can have an impact on our well-being. Similarly, Aristotle suggested that the ultimate purpose in life was to live the good life by focusing on this set of golden mean of virtues. Thomas Jefferson included the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence, and Abraham Maslow proposed a hierarchy of human needs with steps to this concept of self-actualization. Since then, a guy named Dr. Martin Seligman has been working on well-being research in general and has created a model that is fairly commonly used to measure well-being. He's done work both in the US military, the Australian government, and his model looks at 5 things that individually and separately contribute to well-being, that people pursue for their own sake and are independent of other factors. So the relevance of this, perhaps for this group, is that there are some persistent challenges that well-being in the workplace could have an impact on. And we're going to talk about some of those relationships later on. But those include things like satisfaction with your job and supervisors, levels of stress and burnout, as well as individual performance and retention in the organization. So we're going to get to some of those results in a little while, but I just want to kind of prep you for where we're going. So when we think about this idea of wellness and well-being, they tend to go together in this, what we call a virtuous circle. So wellness, being as freedom from disease and having a healthy lifestyle, has an impact on your psychological well-being. And your psychological well-being has an impact on your level of wellness, going back to Buddha, that you are what you think. And together, this virtuous circle can have a positive impact on employee engagement, which we're going to see in some of the data that I'll present. And that employee engagement can also then have an impact on a person's overall well-being as well as their workplace well-being. So right now in the training and development space, there's sort of a well-being boom going on. Research has shown that happiness or well-being is something that can be a goal and can be measured. In psychology, we've moved from the idea of treating illness to self-optimizing, which is the movement away from clinical types of psychology to this idea of positive psychology. Right now, there's about a $40 billion being spent for some of the global workforce to improve well-being. And employers are supporting the well-being. Employer support of well-being is becoming a norm and not an exception. There is some research from the World Happiness Report, which shows that there are positive associations for people if they have higher levels of mental and physical health and well-being, and that there's also an awful lot of stress in the world, even though people are working slightly less than they might have been historically. So well-being is very popular and has some positive effects. There's been some research to show that there is a positive impact on job performance. I'm not going to go through all of these studies, but basically what the chart is showing is that the percentage of job performance that can be accounted for by well-being, and you can see there it can be a fairly large number or a fairly relatively small number, but not trivial. And similar to that, some research that's looked at a good day at work has found that when people are having whatever a good day at work is for them, they're more productive, they're more creative, and they're more likely to recommend their organization as a place to work. So well-being is important. It has some positive impacts on people. The work that we've been doing was really focused on developing a measure of well-being at work. A few years ago, back when we could attend conferences, I attended a conference. I went to a dozen sessions on, quote, well-being. But what I found there was that not a single one of those people actually measured well-being. They measured stress, or they measured burnout, or they measured some other negative outcome, and then sort of treated the lack of burnout or the lack of stress as well-being. And I would argue that the absence of negative things does not necessarily mean it's a positive thing. So much of the work that we've been doing is to build up this measure, ensure that it works the way we want it to, and then now we're getting to some applications. But before we dive in, we're going to do a short poll. It's going to take over your screen, so if you would, please respond quickly. And basically, the poll question is just, how are you feeling today on a scale of 1 to 5? All right, so looking at the folks who have voted, we're about 80%, so thank you very much. The number one, people are at a 4, so they're generally in a good place. 17% are at a 5, in a very good place, and about a third are neutral. No one is the unhappy red face, which is very good. This is very similar to what we see in terms of well-being at work, well-being in general. People generally have a fairly positive outcome, or are fairly positive. And this is true of a variety of different measures of like happiness, well-being, life satisfaction, things like that. So the next thing we're going to do, if I can get past the poll, is a self-reflection exercise. And I'm going to give 20 to 30 seconds on each of the following questions. What I'd like you to do, if you're willing, is to type your responses to these into the questions area, and then after a few seconds, I'll have Caitlin read out a couple, of things that people are saying. So again, don't use the chat area, use the question area, please. So the first question is, think of the last situation where you felt sustained positive emotion at work, whether it was joy, cheerfulness, happiness, amusement, awe. How did this feeling of sustained positive emotion affect your work? Go ahead and think about that. If you want to just write it down, that's fine. If you want to type something into the questions that you're willing to have Caitlin read off without names, that's fine too.
Okay, so we're definitely getting some responses.
Okay,
And
go ahead,
a lot of people are saying it gave them more energy, it made them more productive, they wanted to take on more tasks and do more things throughout their day, and they were more creative and less resistant to trying different things. That's pretty consistently what's coming in.
Very good. Okay, so the next one, if I can get it to go, is think of a person you have a positive relationship at work, and what makes it positive for you? And again, if you just type into the questions, Caitlin will read some off once we hit critical mass.
Okay, so a lot of mutual respect, lack of judgment, and positive intentions. We're also seeing a lot of collaboration and trust being mentioned, as well as honesty and transparency.
Excellent. So the next one is, think of a time when you thoroughly enjoyed a work activity that used your strengths and talents. What was that experience like for you?
Okay. Wow, a lot of people saying energizing. That is being said almost by everyone. Also bringing great satisfaction, very fulfilling, made me want to do more. It didn't feel like work is also being said a lot.
Excellent. So the next one is, think of a role or activity you undertake at work that gives you a sense of meaning and purpose. And how does that sense of meaning and purpose give you or help you and help others?
Okay. So starting to see if you come in with this one, mostly in creating leadership programs or how they are influenced as a leader and being a better leader. There is energy that gets transferred to the entire team. They're more attentive to others when they feel good about their contribution and their work. And a lot of wanting to make others feel the same way that they're feeling. So it kind of is a domino effect.
Excellent. So the next one is, think of something that gives you a sense of achievement at work. And how does this sense of achievement make you feel?
Okay, so them coming in with happy, confident, productive, and fulfilling, makes me feel accomplished, a lot of happy and satisfied put together, as well as productive, a lot of productive as well.
Okay, cool. So the last question, kind of switch up a little bit, is, when did you last feel a strong negative emotion at work? Angry, depressed, anxious, dejected? And how did that strong negative emotion affect your work?
Okay, so we're seeing less productive and discouraged, distracted, lower productivity, loss of focus, shut down, deflating, frustrated, couldn't concentrate. A lot of people saying that they felt shut down and they felt like they needed a break and couldn't do their work the way that they want to.
Excellent. So you're asking yourself, Rich, why did you make me go through this self-reflection exercise? And the answer is because those are very short questions, and the reactions that people gave are right in line with what we see. But this is the model that we use to measure workplace well-being. So Seligman has the PERMA model. But what we found in doing our work is that positive and negative emotions are independent. And if you think about it, in the course of a day, or maybe even the course of an hour, you can go from having a very positive set of emotions to very negative emotions if something happens in your workplace. So the model that we use taps into 6 elements that we call the Preman model. And you can see here how those are related to the questions that I was asking. So the first one's about positive emotions. The second one's about relationships. The next is engagement, meaning, accomplishment, and then the experience of negative emotions or the absence of negative emotions. And these 6 things come together to form our model of workplace well-being. So I'm going to briefly go through those in a little bit more detail because most of the data that I'm going to talk about focuses on these 6 elements plus the overall well-being. So, and none of this is like rocket science, so it'll be somewhat brief, but basically positive emotions are things such as happiness, pleasure, and satisfaction. Researchers have found that positive emotions contribute to success in relationships, work, health, and and that there are a number of things that people can do to help improve their positive emotions. Engagement is the deep psychological connection in an activity, cause, or an organization. Some of you may have heard of this idea of flow, which is a single-minded immersion and concentration in some intrinsically motivating task. So for some people, it might be playing music. For other people, it might be doing sports. Depending on what you really enjoy doing, it could be anything where you just lose your sense of time and space, and you're completely engaged in this activity. If you've ever experienced flow, it's a great feeling, and it's often hard to reproduce, but you can work at improving it. Relationships, of course, have to do with positive relationships with other people at work. It involves mutual feelings of caring, support, and satisfaction with the relationships that we have. And it can be outside of work. It can be, through parts of the community, through family, what have you. People with positive relationships in their life tend to experience less mental illness, have better physical health, and longer lifespans. Acts of kindness are one way of improving your relationships. Some research has shown that employees who have a best friend at work are more likely to be engaged at their jobs, and they're more likely to be engaging with customers. So having those positive relationships with at least one person at work are critical. The idea of meaning is if Nietzsche said that if you have a why to live, you can bear almost any how. A meaningful life can be extremely satisfying in the face of hardship, whereas a meaningless life would be an ordeal even without hardship. Meaning involves having a sense of purpose and direction in life and at work, and feeling connected to something bigger than yourself. A lot of people find meaning in the work that they do in terms of how their work has a positive impact on customers or broader society. And finding that sense of meaning is critical for your well-being at work. And finally, next is the sense of accomplishment. Accomplishments pursuing success, winning, or progress, or mastery for its own sake, regardless of whether it brings positive emotions, engagement, relationships, or meaning. Activities that we seek to achieve these are activities we seek to achieve without coercion from others. And when you've completed the activity, whatever it might be, you stand up and just have this great sense of, oh my gosh, I really accomplished something significant and meaningful today. There's a mindset for achievement that you can have, and it's more important than IQ in terms of performance based on some prior research. So just pursuing this idea of I'm going to accomplish something, and ideally something meaningful, for others is an important part of your well-being at work. And finally, having low negative emotions is important. Like I said before, we found that in the model we were developing, negative emotions and positive emotions were separate things. And so we will treat those separately throughout our discussion. So just for a moment, think about, we've gone through the self-reflection exercise. If you would think about at your work on a scale of 1 to 10, which one of these things do you think is highest for you? And again, if you just type into the question box, what's your main driver of well-being? Is it emotions? Is it relationships? Is it engagement? Which one seems to be your main one at work? And again, if you just type that into the question box. And Caitlin, if you could just give us a sense of a gestalt, top 2 or 3.
Sure. I would say top is positive emotions right now. And then it's looking like, I think relationships is number 2, with engagement coming in probably really close to number 3 or tied for number 2.
Okay, excellent. So we're going to get into some of the meat here of the work that we've been doing. So we've created this thing, we're calling it the Global Wellbeing at Work Inventory, or GWWI. It has these 6 measures in it. It's currently 28 items. We're actually expanding it to 30. And because I do measurement stuff for a living, I have to throw in this one slide that just shows the internal consistency and reliabilities of the measures as they are right now. And for those of you who have some psychometric exposure, you can see that we're doing reasonably well on the reliabilities for these measures. Much of what I will talk about for the rest of the session is actually validity evidence, although I'm going to contextualize it differently. So far we have been doing the Global Workplace Wellbeing Inventory in the May-June timeframe. In fact, we're going to start the next round next Monday. We've collected data from almost 18,000 people from 2016 to 2020. Our sample is primarily female, and the average age of the people who are participating is 43. And so looking at the overall results, this is collapsing across the different times that we've measured well-being. We see that on average, across these 18,000 people report a workplace well-being of about 7.52. Like I said before, this is very similar range on a 10-point scale to what you see if you ask people, are you happy? Are you satisfied with your life? Things like that. And regardless of socioeconomic status and culture and country and location and all sorts of things, this seems to be the value that we're at for all of those kinds of things. Generally speaking, people are positive, and generally speaking, people are pretty satisfied. When we look at the different elements, kind of going back to some of the things I asked about, you'll see that in our sample across these 5 years, the number one thing that's driving people's workplace well-being is relationships, followed by meaning and accomplishment. And keep in mind that the negative emotion is not being reversed here. So it's the level, this is, you want that number to actually be lower than as low as possible. And we're going to see these patterns kind of repeat, but the important thing is that relationships, meaning, and accomplishment seem to be the main drivers of overall workplace well-being. When we look at the trends over time, which you can see here, hopefully you can see my cursor, you'll notice that across all of these, it's fairly stable. We're not seeing wide vacillations from time 1 to time 2. And like I said, we tend to do this every year at about the same time. For 2020, during the pandemic, you'll notice a bit of a drop in positive emotions, a little bit of an increase in negative emotions, and generally speaking, slightly lower scores overall. But again, the important thing is that you don't see wild vacillation. So the point of that is, as you try to improve your well-being, you shouldn't expect to see huge increases, but it's something you can persist at over time to get slow gains. When we look at, so one of the questions that came up when I was presenting this data before was about gender. And because we have a huge sample, 18,000 people, these are statistically significant differences. But if you look at the size of the differences, they're not very large. So don't get too focused on gender, although just kind of keep in mind one key outcome. And I feel okay saying this because it was brought up to me by someone in the audience. But when I showed this slide and I said, I don't know what to make of it, because you'll notice that females tend to report higher levels of both positive and negative emotions, and are generally more positive in general. But a woman in the audience said, well, it's just because females simply experience more emotions during the course of their lives. Made sense to me. I don't feel like I'm being sexist in saying that because it was her idea. But the point here is that, generally speaking, females are more positive than males. When we look at age, we see some really interesting findings. And I know this slide is very busy. But what I want you to focus on is, these are for different age groups, starting with the 18 to 24 over to 65 plus. If you look, you'll see there are some real big differences in the slopes of these. So you'll notice that for overall well-being, it tends to increase with age, and it tends to increase quite a bit with age. Similar for positive emotions, similar for engagement and meaning, not quite as much for accomplishment. And I think that for the engagement, meaning, and accomplishment elements of the model, if you think about it, when you first exit college or high school, you get a job, you take a job. And then over time, you either create the job that's right for you at that employer, or you change employers to find a job that's a better fit for you. And so it makes sense that over time, people change jobs either by changing their job or changing the work that they're doing in an organization to improve those things. You'll also notice that for emotions, I think as people mature, they experience more positive emotions and fewer negative emotions. And then going back to the relationship element, recall that was the #1 thing contributing to people's overall workplace well-being. It's fairly flat. It's not completely flat, but fairly flat. And what that says is that relationships are important early on. People work at them, but it's harder to improve those, if you will, as you age. They tend to be more stable. So an area to spend some energy if you're trying to improve your workplace well-being. We've also looked at data by different countries, and I just have a small smattering of samples here. Keep in mind that the data we have is primarily US data. So you'll see that the US and the overall are very similar. You'll also notice that, generally speaking, the UK is lower on most things with the exception of engagement than the US. Canada is higher. When we look at some other countries, or global regions, because we've looked at the data multiple ways, the highest scoring country/region is Australia, New Zealand, and and Latin America. And the lowest scoring is Asia, people who are in Asia. I talked to some friends of mine in Singapore and said, does that make sense to you? And they were like, oh yes, it makes great sense. The way that their world is, their culture is, it's very stressful. It's very stressful compared to Western culture. So we have a lot of data on different countries. We also have data looking at occupations. Now, if you look at the top part of the graph, historically, all of the occupations, broad buckets from ONA, were in the helping areas. So education, training in the library, healthcare. Management emerged after the last round of data collection as one of the top 3. But if you think about it, especially perhaps this is due to COVID, there's a lot more helping things that management is doing now, given that people have all these reactions to COVID. You'll also notice that the more blue-collar, service-oriented, but not people helping service-oriented jobs tend to have lower levels of well-being. And you'll also notice that from the bottom to the top, it's almost a 1-point difference. It's over 1-point difference on a 10-point scale. So as you're thinking about your level of well-being or the well-being of the people at your work, there's a number of things that we have to keep in mind. And I'll summarize those in a minute. But what we also know, and like I said, this is somewhat validity data for the instrument, but also shows relationships with important organizational outcomes. So over time, we've measured a host of different things along with workplace well-being. And going back to those persistent HR issues, what we see is that when people have higher levels of workplace well-being, they also report higher levels of supervisor satisfaction, higher levels of supervisor support, and higher levels of job satisfaction. Workplace well-being and job satisfaction are very highly correlated. They're not the same thing, but they're similar things. We also see on the negative side that as workplace well-being increases, we see lower levels of self-reported stress with the relationships, which makes sense, right? If relationships are one of the key drivers of well-being, if you have positive relationships, you shouldn't have some stress over those. But we also see workload stress being negatively related. And as people have higher levels of workplace well-being, they're less likely to report burnout. In terms of organizational outcomes, what we see is that when people have higher levels of workplace well-being, they report a higher level of emotional attachment to the organization. They report a higher level of an overall sense of commitment to the organization. People also report doing what we call organizational citizenship behavior, where they are engaging in things to help their colleagues. So it might be helping somebody with some work that they need to do, or doing something that's not in my job description that's over and above what is required of me to help a colleague, or something that's not in my job description over and above to help the organization as a whole. These might be volunteer things or showing up for, staying late, or who knows what it might be exactly, but people are more likely to engage in these organizational citizenship behaviors. And then finally, in terms of retention, at higher levels of workplace well-being, we see that people are less likely to have a specific intention to be actively searching for a job. And they also are less likely to report that the only reason they're staying is they don't see any other options. So overall, as workplace well-being goes up, there are a lot of positive outcomes for the organization, as well as positive outcomes for the individual. And going back to the job satisfaction thing, one of the having been doing this stuff for a very long time, organizations often measure job satisfaction and do things to try to improve job satisfaction as it's a proxy for organizational performance. The tricky bit is that from an employee's perspective, if you're doing things to, quote, improve their satisfaction, those are not necessarily things that are good for the, obviously on the face of it, good for the employee. They're good for the organization. By switching from job satisfaction to thinking about workplace well-being, I think, and I'm trying to not be cynical here, it changes, the discussion with the workforce to say, hey, look, there are good things that come if you have a higher level of well-being for the organization, but that's not our focus. Our focus is on improving your well-being for you, and any of these other benefits that are on the screen right now are secondary. Whereas if it's job satisfaction, I feel like that organizational benefits are more primary and the employee is more secondary. So that's a lot of information. Just a quick summary of where we are so far. So on average, well-being is high. It's especially high for relationships. There are very small gender differences, but not something worth focusing on. We see that as people get older, their level of workplace well-being tends to go up. It's probably due to more and more control over the work that they're doing. We also see that there are some gender differences in based on the occupations that you're in. And then we also see that there are some positive effects for individuals and organizations. So that's a quick summary of where we are so far. But then, given that we're the Myers-Briggs company, what about the role of personality in well-being? So very briefly, I'm assuming most of you are familiar with the Myers-Briggs type indicator and the model that it uses. But basically, what it's doing is it's measuring 4 preferences: extroversion, introversion, sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling, judging, and perceiving. And briefly, extroversion, introversion is where you get your energy from. Sensing and intuition is how you take in information. Thinking and feeling is how you make decisions, and judging and perceiving is how you deal with the world around you. And then those 4 things come together to create the 16 types, which hopefully you're familiar with. So most of the data that we've collected has been from people who have taken the MBTI. Part of the reason we see very positive results might be because more enlightened organizations are using the MBTI and they have higher levels of well-being. We don't know that, but I have tried to look into that. But here you can see, based on MBTI types, the level of overall workplace well-being. Again, it's fairly high, but you'll notice that it's higher for extroverts than it is for introverts. The type with the lowest level of workplace well-being just so happens to be my type, ISTP, at 7.1, and the highest level are for ESTJs and ENFJs at 7.9. Again, almost a 1-point difference on that 10-point scale just based on type. Historically, a colleague of mine who worked with me on this is an ENFP. Historically, we saw that ISTP was the lowest and ENFP was the highest. But that changed with our last data collection. When we look at the different elements of the model, you'll see this pattern that just kind of plays out. So people who are more introverted tend to report lower levels of positive emotions than extroverts, and that's consistent with what we see other models who measure extroversion concepts. You see the same pattern for relationships, but you also notice that relationships are, the main driver. They're above average, the overall well-being. You also see for engagement, that's similar pattern, but not quite as large. So both introverts and extroverts tend to engage. For meaning, again, you see the same pattern. Some introverts tend to experience more meaning, probably has a lot to do with their job. If you look down at the ISTJs, for instance, whereas ISTPs, my type, everything is a challenge. You're an ISTP, just a joke. And then accomplishment and negative emotions. So you'll notice that this pattern sort of holds. There are some differences based on type. It sort of goes as you are more towards the ISTJ side or ISTP side, you generally have lower levels of things. As you move towards the ENFP types, they tend to go up. And so the reason this is important is that a lot of organizations will approach well-being with, we're going to do yoga, or we're going to do, something that everyone gets to do. And we know from looking at the data that we've collected that one size does not fit all when it comes to well-being. Different types report different things, and more importantly, report qualitatively different things in terms of what they do for their well-being. So just to pick on my friend who's an ENFP, had a conversation. One of the things that people say they tend to do is spend time with other people as a way to improve my well-being. An ISTP, not me, somebody else I know, said, but only with people I actually like. Whereas my ENFP friend said, with pretty much anybody, I just like to spend time with people. It makes me feel better. So even though they might do similar things, there are some qualitative differences in how different types approach improving their well-being. So, excuse me. So again, going back to the question box, if you would, think about one thing that you do at work that you do purposefully to enhance your workplace well-being, and think about one thing you do outside of work purposefully to try to enhance your work well-being or well-being in general. And if you would, just type that into that question box again, have Caitlin share a couple, and then we'll see how well what you suggest matches what our research is showing.
Okay, so we're starting to see a few come in. Someone said they do meditations at work. Someone else said they seek out to build new relationships, working on projects in an organized way. A lot of people are saying outside of work they do exercise or they go for walks. spending time with family and friends. At work, controlling my calendar, finding more time to interact with team members, and yeah, a couple other people have said meditations, exploring interests that are related to work if possible.
Okay, excellent.
Most of that.
So thanks everybody for participating. So we've been looking at this now for 5 years. Actually, we didn't do it. The first year we only looked at outside of work activities, and now we've been focusing exclusively on inside of work activities. But at work, we see these are the top 5 things in the research that we've conducted. Focus on work tasks that interest you, focus on tasks that makes you feel positive, take on new work where you can learn something, breaks, which we see a lot of, and challenging work that adds to your knowledge and skills. Now you'll notice that a lot of these, the focus ones, these are fairly cognitive activities going back to, you know, the start of the presentation in the comments from Buddha. That, you know, there's a lot of cognitive stuff that people can do to improve their well-being. I'm sensing I'm not in a good place. I'm going to go and switch these things. You'll notice too that when we go back to that occupation differences, people who are in more white-collar jobs tend to have more control over their day-to-day activities, whereas people in more blue-collar jobs tend to have less control over those things. So you can see how some of these things play out and why it's important to look at different activities based on some of those things that I've talked about. Outside of work, we see a lot of exercise, which Caitlin mentioned. People just, again, cognitively focusing on the positives in their lives. But the number one thing across all types, actually, is spending time with family and friends, and I've already kind of elaborated on how those are different. Listening to music and reading. A lot of things outside of work are distractions from maybe the things that are bothering you. So hopefully there's some things you see on this list. We have some tips based on type, MBTI type, that I believe Caitlin will share after the session is over. But so when we, at the end of the day, our mission, our purpose at the Myers-Briggs company is to help people have these more successful and fulfilling lives. And there's a process that we have been talking to organizations about that they can use to try to improve the well-being in their workplace for their employees. And of course, the first step, not surprisingly, is to figure out where you're at. Some sort of internal audit, and I'm not necessarily saying that you should use our instrument, but some sort of audit, discussions, conversations to find out where are people at, what are we doing right now that, you know, is working or isn't working, and what's the impact, or, you know, how are we doing as an organization? And then looking at all of that information to figure out what can we do differently to identify and implement some well-being strategies. It might be that, you know, who knows what people might come up with. It might be that you do a survey or you do some interviews, but from this list of possible things, you'd want to select the things that you think would work the best, promote and communicate these to your staff, to get people to engage, and then over time get some feedback. And then, you know, after some period of time, do a check-in to see how well is it working. Perhaps you'll do some sort of audit every 12 months, you know, see how you're doing, make adjustments, and make changes. And this is a process that, like I said, is you know, not that complicated and has some real benefits in terms of just, you know, engaging your workforce and figuring out what's going to work for you, rather than having, you know, the executives sort of sit around and figure out, this is what I think we should do yoga. And I'm not picking on yoga, I love yoga. So one of the things that we're doing at the Myers-Briggs company within this model is stressing the importance of and offering some training on leadership and relationships in terms of inclusion. And so we've built out a program that is looking at this set of core competencies around leadership inclusion, or inclusive leadership, which tend to map onto some of the things that are in the well-being model. So the first one is understanding people and what they need to enhance their well-being, and the competencies there are self-awareness and humility. The program will help you understand how to communicate more effectively. So that relates to curiosity of other people and openness in terms of inclusion. understanding strategies to increase inclusion in work teams, and that has to do with understanding and how to make use of empathy and leveraging differences that exist to be more effective. And then understanding and drawing on people's natural strengths as part of inclusion, which is looking for people who demonstrate courage and leaders who demonstrate courage, as well as flexibility in how they communicate. If you go back to the MBTI model, it's all about understanding how I do things, how you do things, and figuring out how we can be flexible to accommodate each other's differences. And so we have this program out there that may be helpful in terms of both inclusive leadership, but it should also have an impact on workplace well-being. So if you work with your leaders to improve those competencies, one would expect to see increases in positive emotions, decreases in negative emotions, improve supervisor and coworker relationships. Ideally, you can also work on things to make work more meaningful and more engaging. And when you have more engaging and meaningful work and better relationships, hopefully increase the sense of accomplishment. So there is some evidence to suggest in the Harvard Business Review article that when employees work in more inclusive teams and for more inclusive organizations, which again, we really start with leadership, they feel that they're treated respectfully and fairly. They feel that they belong, are valued, and feel confident and inspired to contribute and share their perspective. So there's a lot of positive outcomes from a well-being perspective that can result from trying to improve the level of inclusiveness in your workplace. And finally, I'm just going to wrap it all up. So we've walked through a lot of stuff, and I know it was a lot. You did some self-reflection to see where you're at and what part of your work might be the most important. Relationship seems to be a big one for many of the folks here, as well as in our data. We've looked at the model and the impacts that it has in terms of positive impacts for people in general, as well as at work. We've looked at how workplace well-being can be impacted by age, location, job type, and personality. And we know that from that, there are some challenges maybe with introverts and extroverts. Introverts just tend to have lower levels of workplace well-being and might need different strategies to help them improve compared to extroverts. Oftentimes, the leadership in organizations tend to be more extroverted, and they tend to go with extroverted solutions that just don't work well for the introverts. Like I said, we have ongoing research on this. We're starting the next survey next Monday. Caitlin, in one of her bits of outreach, will send you, if you're interested, a link to that survey. Feel free to share that with anyone that you might want to, but we'd certainly appreciate you joining us and looking at workplace well-being as we come out of the COVID pandemic. And then finally, if you're interested, we do have this inclusive leadership program, which can have some positive impacts for your employees' well-being. If you're interested, Caitlin will also provide some info on that. And with that, I'm going to throw it back to Caitlin and see if we have any questions. And again, thank you very much, everyone who is here. I really appreciate your participation and attention.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I am just going to wrap a few things up while some of these questions are coming through as well. So as Rich mentioned, we will be sending an email out to everybody with a link to the recording and the slides, and I will be including those tips based on different MBTI types, as well as a link to the survey if you'd like to participate. And then of course, if there's anything that you want more information on, you can feel free to reply to that email or email us now if you'd like, and we can get you any additional information that you would like. And so we do have a couple of questions coming in. So the first question is there any difference, or do you know what the difference is between the well-being responses for people who have reported types of introvert versus extrovert?
I don't understand the question. I'm sorry. What?
So I'm rephrasing for the preferences of, but do you know why there would be a difference in the types for well-being with introverts and extroverts?
Oh, I see. Okay. So it's interesting that, like, if you're using 5-factor model or CPI or any personality assessment that taps this introversion extroversion thing, And keep in mind, the MBTI definition is different than like the 5-factor model definition. We tend to see that introverts have just, they just are generally less satisfied. The why of that, I do not know. I could make wild hypotheses. I think it's probably loops back into relationships. Extroverts, I think, just generally speaking, have an easier time forming, maintaining relationships with people, depending on your degree, if you will, of introversion. From the 5-factor model, it's more of a gregariousness thing, how friendly and outgoing you are. From the MBTI, it's more about where you're energized. And so if you're an introvert and you're energized by being in your own head, which I can appreciate as an ISTP, you're spending time doing that rather than those things that help you create relationships. So it sort of gets to the same place, but that is just conjecture. I don't really know specifically. I will say, when we looked at the qualitative data on these different things people do, we didn't ask for all of the things. We asked for like the top 5. We did see differences based on introversion and extroversion for most of the social things, where it's really more about having these really close, good, high quality, but small number of relationships versus the broader ones that extroverts report. And so there's probably something there too, but I just don't really know for sure. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. And a follow-on to that was, in your research that you're continuing, do you have any plans to ask questions that differ from in an office workspace versus an at-home workspace?
Actually, we've done a fair amount of research as a company on virtual work, and we have looked at some of the differences. And it's just a different summary that, if you're interested, just send Caitlin a note and we can get you those summary. I lost track of the question. I think it was, are we going to ask specifically about that? No, we're not asking about that. The last time we asked about people at work, we tried to get, it was a year ago, so the pandemic was just starting to get really going. And we weren't expecting it to go for a year. So we asked people to think back to, what would you do in your normal work environment? This time, we're not doing that. We're just letting people answer the questions in terms of, what do you do when you're at work? And if you're working from home, you might do different things than if you're working from an office, or what have you. We do have a question about whether or not people are working virtually as part of the MBTI questions that we can link to. So that's a very poor answer to your question, but no, we're not specifically doing that. But you've made me think about it now, so now I might. Because I still have time to change, so I might just add a question on that.
Okay, well that's great. Okay, and then I think maybe the last question, we might have time for 2 more, but as a manager of a small team, do you have a recommendation on where to start with this? If you're, trying to assess the well-being of your team, or if you know you want to improve the well-being of your team, just the best starting place.
So those questions that we did, that self-reflection exercise, if you have a small team that's able to talk freely, and you could just start there. And ask people to, just kind of like what we did, jot these things down and then have a discussion about it. And then, if assuming that they're comfortable, especially in smaller teams, people tend to be more comfortable. You could just say, well, what are the things that we could work on as a group to improve from this model, and agree to one of those things. I would recommend you. A lot of times with those kinds of discussions, there's no action that follows. So I would highly recommend you say, all right, let's talk about it. Let's set some goals for the team, maybe individual goals, and let's follow up on those in a couple of months and see how we're doing, and then maybe revisit it. It doesn't have to be a huge formal process. And those six questions, they're not as good as psychometric measure, but hey, they're a reasonable place to start.
Okay, great. And I think we do have time for one more question. I do see some questions coming in specifically about some of our practitioners and consultants. So I will be answering those questions via email because they're a little bit different. So if you are a practitioner asking a question, I will get back to you later today. So the last question that we have is going to be, what are your thoughts on company-wide well-being initiatives? I know you mentioned yoga earlier, but do you
Yeah, I
think
took
that
on yoga.
do you think that
So
those are still beneficial?
I think that I'm going to say yes and no. So if it's a one size fits all, here's the 4 things we're going to offer that we think are going to improve workplace well-being. I think that's generally a bad idea. The reason is that there are huge personality differences in terms of what people find valuable. By way of example, I'll pick on the company I work for now, which is the Myers-Briggs company. Years and years ago, we were having a similar conversation, and somebody said, we should do an awards ceremony and have people come up and get a trophy and maybe even give a little speech. Can you imagine, if you're an introvert, how horrible and punishing that sounds? I mean, that's not a reward. So that's the kind of thing that happens when it's done in isolation with the C-suite, or not to be mean, but in HR. And so what I would recommend is talking to people and finding out what, whether it's, again, do discussions, do some sort of survey, what are the things that they think would be beneficial. You can look at the type tips that we're going to send out, and then offering up maybe an a la carte. And so rather than spending, your budget on 3 things, just kind of say, well, what would you be interested in? What, can we offer 10 things and you get to choose 2 of them, and keep the budget the same, but at least they're things that are a better fit for you as an individual based on, age, gender, personality type, what have you. So that's my bias. It's a pretty strong bias. But my experience is that when things are done company-wide, organization-wide, and as companies get larger, they just tend to be not useful.
Yes, we did have something I'm assuming was coming from someone with a preference for introversion who responded with an emphatic yuck. So I think that definitely that resonates, especially if it's something that is not going to be in your comfort zone. So
Right.
awesome. Okay, well, that is all the time we have for questions today. If you have any other questions that you think of later on, feel free to send us an email, and Rich and I will be going through those to make sure that we get all of those questions answered. So otherwise, thank you so much for joining, everyone, and we will be sending this out, the video as well as the slides, so you can look for that tomorrow morning. And that's about it. So thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.